They weren't his wives, nor his responsibility. But they were his uncle's final promise. When the world came to burn them out, Jesse chose to stand and rebuild something unbreakable. Jesse Carter rode slow up the trail, his horse blowing dust from its nostrils, the sun slipping behind the far hills. He had not planned on coming back to this part of the country, but the letter had found him anyway, telling him his uncle was dead and that a cabin in the wild hills now belonged to him. Jesse had no kin worth naming, and no money left to his name, so a cabin sounded like more than he deserved. He pictured a quiet place, maybe a roof that leaked, a stove that smoked, but at least walls to keep out the wind. He did not expect anything more, and in truth, he never asked for it. When he reached the clearing, the place stood waiting, a squat figure of timber and stone, its door shut, the windows dark. Weeds brushed against the steps, and a crow shifted on the roof beam. Jesse swung down from his saddle, his legs stiff, and tied the reins to a post. The smell of pine was sharp in the air, mixed with the faint odor of old ash. He felt like a trespasser already, though the deed in his pocket said otherwise. He pushed open the door and froze. Inside were not cobwebs and silence, but 5 women sitting or standing as if they had been waiting for him. Their faces turned toward him all at once, their eyes sharp, some frightened, some defiant. The air was close and heavy, carrying the scent of worn dresses and bread gone stale. Jesse let the door swing shut behind him, the sound echoing too loud. The oldest of the women stood first, her gray hair pulled tight, her frame still strong despite the years. She said his uncle's name with a question, but when Jesse shook his head, she narrowed her eyes. He explained in few words that the man was dead, that the cabin had passed on to him. At this, the women exchanged looks, a ripple of unease moving through them. One of the younger ones, with tangled dark hair and a smudge of dirt on her cheek, said softly that they had been promised as brides, bound to a man now buried in the earth. Jesse felt the floor tilt under him. He had never wanted responsibility, never wanted ties, yet here stood 5 women who claimed no place but this. Their dresses were worn thin, their shoes patched, their faces lined not with years alone but with hardship. One stared at him with suspicion, another with weary hope, and the youngest would not lift her eyes at all. He tried to speak, to tell them he was only passing through, but the words caught in his throat. The truth was, he had nothing behind him, and nothing ahead but this cabin. And now these women, bound not by choice but by desperation, stood like ghosts in the dying light. Jesse's boots scraped the floor as he shifted, and he realized that his inheritance was not land or wood or stone. It was them, and the silence between them pressed heavier than any debt he had ever carried. The night pressed close around the cabin, and Jesse sat on the edge of the wooden chair, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes moving from one woman to the next. Their names came slowly, given like offerings, each one spoken with a weight that told him more than any story could. Miriam was the oldest, her back straight, her gray eyes steady, the one who spoke first and with authority, though her hands trembled when she thought no one watched. Ruth sat nearest the fire, her face pale and sharp, her lips pressed thin, as if she held back words that might cut deeper than knives. Isabel leaned against the wall, her dark hair falling across her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the floor, the kind of silence that could turn into rage if tested. Clara, perched by the window, her fingers wrapped tight around the sill, watching the darkness outside as though expecting it to rise against them at any moment. And Juniper, the youngest, barely more than a girl, sat cross-legged on the floor, with her arms folded tight around herself, eyes darting like a trapped bird, speaking nothing at all. Jesse cleared his throat once, but the sound felt wrong, like breaking glass in a church. He had thought the cabin would be his, a place to rest after years of drifting, but now he felt like a trespasser in a room claimed by silent shadows. They did not ask him to leave, yet neither did they welcome him. He was the stranger here, even though the deed bore his name. He wanted to ask why they had stayed, why they had not left when the man who bound them was put in the ground, but the words would not form. There was something in the way they carried themselves, in the worn fabric of their dresses and the hollowness in their cheeks, that told him they had nowhere else to go. The fire cracked, filling the silence with its small, restless voice. Miriam finally spoke, her tone flat, telling Jesse that his uncle had promised each of them a place, not love, not kindness, but a roof and a share of bread. Some had been sold to him like cattle. Others had fled worse fates and found the cabin at the end of their road. Each story was different, but ended the same, in this single room where their lives had been stitched together by circumstance and grief. Jesse listened, but said little, because he knew any words would fall short. Outside, the coyotes cried in the hills, and the wind pressed against the shutters. Jesse felt the weight of all their eyes, some filled with suspicion, others with quiet hope, and one or two with nothing at all. He realized then that the cabin was no inheritance, not in the way he thought. It was a burden, yes, but also a chance, though he did not yet know what kind. The silence grew heavier, and as he finally leaned back, the truth settled in his bones. He was not the owner of this place. He was only one more shadow among them. Jesse rode into town 2 mornings after settling in the cabin, his boots dusty and his shirt sticking to his back. He only needed nails, a bit of flour, and maybe a coil of rope, but he could feel the weight of eyes before his horse had even stopped at the hitching post. Folks stood in doorways, whispering, their glances sharp as thorns. A boy laughed, not at him exactly, but in the way children echo what their elders say. Jesse kept his head down, but the whispers clung to him all the same. Orphans of shame, someone muttered near the blacksmith's shop, and he knew without asking that they spoke of the women in his cabin. The town had found its story, and Jesse was in the middle of it. At the general store, the owner gave him a long look before filling his order. He leaned across the counter and said quiet, like it was a favor, that men in town would pay good money to take the women off his hands. Not wives, not workers, just mouths to feed for someone else. Jesse felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. Another man, lounging near the stove, grinned and asked if Jesse planned to keep them all for himself, his voice low and dirty, and the others laughed. Jesse gathered his supplies and left without a word, though his hands burned to strike. On the ride back, the hills seemed quieter, the air cleaner, as if the land itself cared little for what men whispered in town. When he reached the cabin, the women were outside. Miriam had her sleeves rolled up, splitting kindling with an axe older than she was, her strokes steady and sure. Ruth was scrubbing clothes in a basin, her hands raw but her back straight. Isabel had climbed onto the roof, tugging away rotted shingles, while Clara held the ladder firm and Juniper fetched stones from the creek for the fire pit. Jesse stopped a moment just to watch, struck by how they moved with purpose. No orders given, no one claiming more right than another. He set down his supplies and joined in without thinking. He patched the roof where Isabel pointed, his hands clumsy at first, but steadying with each nail. He carried wood that Miriam split and stacked it neat beside the wall. He hauled water from the creek, and though Ruth said nothing, she shifted her basin closer, so he would not have to walk as far. Clara lifted her eyes once, just long enough to give a nod before turning back to her work. Even Juniper, silent and skittish, brushed dirt from the stones before laying them carefully into the fire ring. The day stretched long, sweat dripping into the dust, the sun leaning low over the ridge. No one spoke much, yet no one stood idle either. By the time the last board was hammered in place and the smoke from the fire curled steady into the sky, Jesse felt something unspoken had passed between them. He had not claimed authority, had not issued a single command, yet the cabin stood stronger because all of them had chosen to work side by side. That night, as the coyotes sang in the distance and the fire burned low, Jesse realized he could not send them away. To drive them into the dust would be to drive himself there too. The sun had barely gone down when the sound of horses came up the trail. Rough voices carrying through the trees, like crows calling over a carcass. Jesse stepped out onto the porch, shotgun in hand, his stomach tight. 5 riders came into view, their faces shadowed beneath wide hats, their laughter sharp and careless. They reined up at the sight of him, and the women behind him, their eyes glittering in the half-light. One of the men called out that the cabin looked lively for a dead man's place, his tone dripping with mockery. Another pointed toward the women, his grin crooked, and asked what a drifter like Jesse was doing with so many brides under one roof. The others laughed, the sound echoing across the clearing. Jesse braced his feet on the boards, the shotgun steady in his hands. Though his heart raced, he felt Miriam step up beside him, a long-handled axe gripped tight, her gray eyes as unyielding as stone. Isabel moved to the window with a rifle that had seen better days, her dark hair falling into her face, but her aim unshaking. Ruth stood by the fire pit, with a poker glowing red at its tip, while Clara and Juniper crouched near the doorway, their shoulders tense, ready to throw stones if it came to it. The raiders hooted at the sight, thinking it a joke, women standing like soldiers, a drifter pretending to be their guard. But when Jesse cocked the shotgun, the sound cut through the laughter. He told them plain they had no business here, his voice low but steady. The leader spat into the dust, muttered something about not wasting bullets on scraps, and with a tug of the reins turned his horse. One by one the others followed, though not without tossing cruel words over their shoulders. Soon the hoofbeats faded into the night, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the heavy thrum of blood in Jesse's ears. When he turned, the women were still standing where they had been, each one holding her weapon like a piece of her soul. Slowly, they lowered them, their breaths unsteady, their faces unreadable. They gathered around the fire, and for the first time since Jesse arrived, words began to spill into the night air. Miriam spoke of losing her children on the river trail, her voice rough but clear. Ruth whispered of a father who traded her for whiskey, each syllable trembling with shame and anger. Isabel said nothing at first, then told of the preacher's fists that left her jaw crooked. Clara admitted she had been left behind by her own kin, unwanted, unclaimed. Juniper did not speak at all, but her eyes glistened in the firelight, as if her silence carried more than words ever could. Jesse listened, his shotgun laid across his knees, the flames painting their faces with gold and shadow. He realized then the cabin was not just wood and stone, not just an inheritance or a roof over his head. It was the only place these women had been allowed to exist without belonging to a master, without being someone's possession. And as the fire burned low and the night wrapped close, Jesse knew he could never let it be taken from them. The wind had been rattling the shutters all night, keeping Jesse from sleep, and when dawn finally broke, he rose from his bedroll with a restlessness he couldn't name. The others were still asleep, their breaths soft in the dim cabin, shadows stretched long across the floor. He crouched by the hearth, feeding the fire with dry twigs, when his boot struck a loose board beneath the rug. It made a hollow sound, one that didn't belong. He pushed the rug aside and pried at the edge of the plank with his knife, until it lifted with a creak. Beneath lay a narrow cavity lined with dust and mouse droppings, and inside it a bundle of papers tied with twine, edges yellowed with time. Jesse sat back on his heels, the bundle heavy in his hands, his heart beating harder than it should. He carried it to the table, brushed away the cobwebs, and untied the knot. The first sheet bore his uncle's scrawl, uneven but clear. Jesse read slow, the words sinking deep. His uncle wrote not of wealth or land, but of women. Not wives, not property, but souls who had been left with nowhere to go. He wrote of how some had been traded to him, others had fled worse hands, and how he had taken them in, not for flesh or labor, but because he could not bear to see them cast aside like broken tools. He confessed that the town believed them brides, but he had never made them so. They were his family, stitched together from pain and circumstance, bound not by blood, but by survival. Page after page carried the same weary truth. He admitted to being a hard man, to making mistakes, but he swore he had never raised a hand against them, had never demanded more than what they wished to give. He spoke of Miriam's strength, of Ruth's sharp tongue, of Isabel's silence, of Clara's watchful eyes, and of Juniper's youth. He said they deserved more than the world had given, and that the cabin was theirs as much as his. At the end, his words grew shaky, and he begged whoever found the letters to see them not as burdens, but as people worth standing beside. Jesse let the papers fall to the table, his throat dry, his hands trembling. The fire popped behind him, the sound loud in the stillness. He had come thinking the cabin was his, an inheritance for a man who had drifted too long, but now he saw it differently. The walls were not just wood and stone. They were witnesses, holding the laughter, the sorrow, the long nights these women had survived within them. His uncle had not left him a home to claim, but a duty to carry. When Miriam stirred and rose from her cot, her gray eyes catching his, Jesse quickly slid the letters back into the bundle. But something had changed in the way he looked at her, and the way he looked at them all. He no longer saw strangers pressed into his life, but a family his uncle had built from the broken pieces the world had thrown away. And whether he wanted it or not, that was what had been given to him. Not land, not freedom, but responsibility heavier than any debt. The night was cool, and the fire burned steady, its light flickering across the rough walls of the cabin. Jesse sat with his back to the logs, the shotgun leaning nearby, though no riders threatened them now. The women had worked hard all day, and their faces showed it, but something in the air was different. They were not just keeping warm by the fire, they were holding on to it, like it was the only safe place left in the world. Jesse had felt the weight of silence between them long enough to know that sooner or later it would break. And that night, it finally did. Miriam spoke first, her voice steady though her eyes carried the dull shine of old grief. She told how she had once had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and how they had tried to ford the river one spring. The current had been stronger than she expected. The wagon tipped, and both little ones had been swept away before her eyes. Her husband left her soon after, blaming her for what had happened, and she had wandered until she came to the cabin. She said it without tears, but the silence afterward was heavy as stone. Ruth shifted where she sat, her sharp face hard in the firelight. She said her father had traded her for a jug of whiskey when she was barely more than a girl, handed her off like she was nothing more than a sack of grain. The man she was given to drank himself into rages and near killed her more than once. But she had run and kept running until she stumbled into the hills. She gave a bitter laugh as she finished, but it was hollow, and her hands twisted together in her lap like they were trying to wring the memory out. Isabel leaned back, her dark hair shadowing her eyes. She had kept her story close, but now she spoke in a low voice, saying she had lived under the roof of a preacher, one who beat his sermons into her with his fists. The scars on her cheek and the crook of her jaw were his doing, reminders carved into her flesh. She said she had escaped one night when he was drunk and never looked back. Her silence since then was not shyness but a shield, and Jesse understood why her eyes burned when they met his. Clara's voice trembled when her turn came. She said she had been traveling with her kin, but when the trail grew rough and the food grew scarce, they had left her behind, calling her weak, saying she would only slow them down. She had stood alone on the dust of the road, watching their backs vanish, and had walked until her feet bled. She came to the cabin because it was the only place that had not turned her away. Juniper, the youngest, said nothing. She only sat with her arms around her knees, eyes wide, watching each face in turn. She had been that way since Jesse first saw her, a quiet shadow, but there was too much knowing in her gaze for her to be a child. She did not speak her story, but it was there in the way she flinched at sudden noises and pressed herself close to the fire, like she feared the dark would swallow her whole. Jesse listened, each word cutting deeper than any bullet he had ever taken. He had thought himself a man hardened by the trail, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of 5 broken lives laid bare beside the fire. When the last words faded into the night, he could not speak. He only stared at the flames, his chest heavy, knowing that what bound them to the cabin was not choice but survival, and that their stories were now tied to his, whether he wanted it or not. The first cold came sooner than anyone expected, a biting wind that swept down from the hills and rattled the shutters like bones. Frost formed on the edges of the cabin windows, and the breath of every sleeper turned to mist in the air. Jesse rose early, his stomach hollow, and found the women already moving about, gathering what little they had. The shelves that had once seemed full now looked bare, the sacks of flour thin, the beans dwindling fast. Hunger gnawed at them all, sharp and steady, and Jesse knew if they did not act, the cabin would not see spring. He took his old traps from the corner, rusted but usable, and showed Miriam how to set them in the brush. Her hands were steady as always, and when the iron teeth snapped shut on a stick she had tested with, she nodded once, as if saying she understood. Ruth followed next, grumbling that she had no patience for snares, but soon her eyes lit with fierce pride when the first rabbit was caught. Isabel proved quick with a knife, skinning and cleaning with the same silence that carried her through most days, though Jesse saw the faintest hint of a smile when Juniper wrinkled her nose at the smell. The women had their own lessons to give. Clara sat Jesse down one evening with a torn sleeve and a needle, guiding his rough fingers through the fabric. He fumbled and cursed under his breath, but she only laughed soft, the sound fragile and rare, until at last the stitches held. Ruth gathered herbs from the hills and brewed a bitter tea that eased Jesse's cough, explaining which leaves healed and which poisoned. Miriam dug near the creek bed, planting roots that would survive the frost, her gray hair falling loose as she worked, her determination as strong as any plowman's. The days grew short, the nights long, yet within the cabin there was a strange kind of light. Hunger still pressed hard, but it was met with work and with moments that caught Jesse by surprise. Once, when the stew pot boiled thin, Isabel told a story from her childhood about stealing apples from an orchard, and though her voice was flat, Ruth let out a sudden laugh. It startled everyone, and soon even Miriam's stern mouth cracked into a smile. Juniper laughed too, a small, quick sound that slipped free before she could stop it, and the whole cabin felt warmer for it. Jesse found himself listening to the rhythm of their voices, the quiet way they spoke to one another, the comfort of work shared. He had thought hunger would tear them apart, but instead it bound them, making every rabbit, every scrap of bread, every firelit story feel like something precious. At night, when the coyotes cried in the distance and the wind clawed at the walls, Jesse would look around the cabin and see not 5 strangers and a drifter, but something closer to family. It was not spoken, and it was not certain, but it was there, in the laughter that rose even when their stomachs ached. The morning was cold and bright when the sound of hooves carried up the trail. Jesse stepped out of the cabin, wiping the frost from his beard, and saw the sheriff riding slow, his coat buttoned high, a paper clutched in one gloved hand. The women gathered behind the door, watching from the shadows, their faces tight. Jesse felt the weight of their eyes on his back as the sheriff drew rein in the clearing. The man didn't waste words. He held out the paper, saying it plain. The cabin wasn't Jesse's until his uncle's debts were cleared. There were back taxes, fees owed to the land office, and whispers of other claims too. Until those were paid, the sheriff said, Jesse had no more right to the cabin than any squatter. He glanced at the women then, his mouth hard, and added that the town wanted them gone. Too much shame followed them, too much unrest stirred by their presence. He said some men had families who didn't like their children seeing those women walking through town, and others had wives who feared their gossip. Jesse folded his arms, the paper still hanging between them. He asked what would happen if the debts were paid, and the sheriff shrugged, saying then the cabin would be his clean and clear. But he warned Jesse it would be easier if the women were sent away. Easier to win the town's favor, and easier to stand without trouble. Behind him, one of the riders who had followed the sheriff muttered that no man in his right mind would tie himself to 5 cast-offs. The fire in Jesse's chest burned hot. Though he kept his face calm, he took the paper without looking at it, his fingers rough against the sheriff's neat fold. He knew the debt was more than he had, but that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the choice standing in front of him, to claim the cabin as his alone or to claim it with the women beside him. He looked back toward the doorway, where Miriam stood half hidden, her eyes steady. Ruth leaned just behind, lips pressed thin, while Isabel's gaze burned with quiet defiance. Clara's hand gripped the frame, and Juniper's small face peeked over her shoulder, wide and waiting. Jesse turned back to the sheriff and said, slow, that the cabin wasn't his alone, that his uncle had promised it as a place of safety, and that he wasn't about to break that promise now. The sheriff's jaw tightened, his horse shifting beneath him, and he said Jesse was making a hard road for himself. Jesse only nodded, saying he had walked harder ones already. The sheriff rode off, dust rising behind him, and Jesse stood long in the cold with the paper in his hand. When he stepped back inside, the women didn't speak, but the air in the room was different. They knew what he had chosen, and though their faces were still guarded, there was a flicker of something softer, something close to trust. The night was heavy with the smell of smoke before Jesse even heard the horses. He had been mending a broken latch when the first shot split the dark, shattering glass from the window. The women froze where they were, eyes wide, but Jesse moved fast, grabbing the shotgun from its place by the door. Outside, torches flared in the blackness, wild figures on horseback circling the clearing. Their laughter was gone this time, replaced with the hard edge of men intent on destruction. One of them hurled a torch against the wall, and flames licked up the wood like hungry tongues. Jesse fired into the night, the recoil jarring his shoulder, and a rider's scream told him he had struck true. Miriam was already at his side, the axe gripped tight in her hands, her gray hair flying loose as she stood in the doorway like a sentinel. Isabel crouched by the shattered window with her rifle braced, her eyes calm and steady as she squeezed off shots into the dark. Ruth grabbed the iron poker from the fire, its tip glowing red, while Clara snatched up a knife and Juniper hurled rocks with sharp accuracy from a basket she had gathered earlier. The cabin shook with gunfire, splinters flying, smoke burning their throats, yet none of them backed down. A bullet tore across Jesse's shoulder, hot pain searing through him, but he held his ground. He barked for Isabel to aim for the horses, and her next shot sent one rider tumbling into the dust. Miriam swung her axe when another raider tried to rush the porch, her blade catching his arm and sending him sprawling back. Ruth's poker flashed, striking another across the face as he lunged through the doorway, the smell of burned flesh filling the room. Clara slashed with her knife at a hand that reached through the broken shutter, blood spraying across the wall, and Juniper's stone cracked against a raider's temple, sending him reeling. The fire spread quick along the cabin's side, the smoke clawing at their lungs. Jesse shouted for Clara and Juniper to fetch water, and the two darted into the chaos, hauling buckets from the barrel by the corner. Sparks rained down on their hair, but they returned again and again, dousing the flames until the wood hissed. The fight raged on through the long hours, every cry answered by the steady rhythm of their defiance. Jesse felt his strength waning, blood soaking his sleeve, yet when he looked around and saw the women fighting at his side, something deeper than pain kept him upright. By the time the first light touched the horizon, the raiders had broken. Their torches lay scattered in the dirt, their bodies strewn across the clearing, their horses vanished into the hills. Smoke curled from the cabin's blackened walls, the edges charred but still standing. Jesse leaned against the doorway, his breath ragged, his wound throbbing, but he saw Miriam lower her axe. Isabel lay down her rifle. Ruth dropped the poker with a hiss, and Clara and Juniper set aside their buckets, their arms shaking. They had fought with fire and blood, with fear and fury. And the cabin still stood, scarred and blackened, but unbroken, like the people within it. The fight left the clearing silent, but for the groan of burned wood and the soft hiss of smoke rising from the blackened edges of the cabin. Dawn had come gray and pale, spreading light over a place that looked more graveyard than home. Jesse sat on the porch steps, his shirt torn and his shoulder bandaged with cloth. Isabel had torn from her skirt. Blood still seeped through, sticky and warm, but the pain felt distant now, dulled by exhaustion. The women moved slowly around him, their faces lined with soot, their hair tangled, their hands raw. No one spoke, for words seemed too fragile after the night they had endured. The porch was streaked with ash where raiders had fallen, and the yard smelled of gunpowder and smoke, but the cabin still stood. Its walls were scarred and blackened, some shingles gone, one shutter hanging loose, but it stood, and so did they. Jesse let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He had seen death enough to know how close it had come to claiming them all, and he knew if not for the women beside him, the cabin would now be nothing but ruin. Miriam lowered herself onto the step next to him, her hands trembling as she brushed soot from her lap. She did not look at him at first, only stared out at the clearing where the bodies had been dragged away. Then she placed her hand on his knee, firm, steady, and whispered words that caught in her throat. Not brides, not widows, family. Her voice cracked, but her eyes were strong, and the others drew closer, one by one. Ruth sat on his other side, her face streaked with ash, her jaw clenched. She placed her hand on top of Miriam's, rough and scarred from years of survival. Isabel followed, silent as ever, her touch light but certain. Clara came next, her fingers shaking as she laid them over the rest, her eyes wet but unashamed. Juniper was last, her small hand pale and thin, but the weight of it was steady, her eyes wide with something like hope. Jesse looked at their hands stacked on his, the skin worn, the nails broken, each one marked by hardship, and he felt something shift deep inside him. His voice came low and hoarse, but steady. "This house is yours as much as mine," he said, his words plain as a prayer. There was no preacher to bless them, no lawman to stamp his seal, only the crackle of fading embers and the sigh of wind through the trees. Yet in that moment it felt binding, more binding than any paper or sermon. They sat together until the sun rose higher, the smoke thinning into the clear sky. And for the first time since Jesse had ridden into the clearing, there was no sense of strangers sharing walls. They were scarred, weary, and bloodied. But they were bound now, not by debt or law, but by choice. The vow was unspoken and unbroken, forged not in scripture, but in fire and survival. The days after the raid were filled with smoke and silence. The cabin stood but barely, its walls blackened, its roof torn open to the sky, its shutters dangling like broken wings. Jesse rose before the sun, his shoulders still stiff from the wound, and gathered what wood he could from the hills. When he returned, he found Miriam already hauling stones to patch the chimney, her back bent, but her spirit unyielding. Ruth stood at the creek, scrubbing soot from salvaged cloth, her sharp tongue softened by the rhythm of work. Isabel climbed onto the roof with hammer in hand, nails clenched between her teeth, her dark hair blowing in the wind. Clara gathered mud and clay to fill the cracks, her hands raw but steady, while Juniper followed her with a basket of moss, silent but purposeful, placing it where the air seeped through. They did not speak of the night before. They did not speak of fear or blood or the men they had buried in shallow earth beyond the ridge. Instead, they worked side by side, their bodies moving with quiet determination. Jesse watched them, his chest tightening with something that was not just pride, but a recognition he had never known before. They were not remnants of another man's bargain, not debts passed to him by chance. They were his companions now, builders of a life stitched together from ruin. He learned their names not as burdens, but as part of his own survival. Miriam, whose strength held the cabin as steady as any beam. Ruth, whose sharp words hid a loyalty fiercer than fire. Isabel, whose silence carried more than most men's sermons. Clara, whose laughter slipped out at odd times, lightening the air when it grew too heavy. Juniper, who spoke little but saw everything, her quiet hands mending what others missed. Each name settled into him like stones laid in a foundation, holding him upright. Some nights they ate little more than thin broth, yet they shared it with a kind of reverence, as though every drop mattered. Jesse caught himself smiling at Ruth's curses when the stew boiled over, or at Juniper's startled giggle when Clara teased her into slipping on the wet grass. Even Isabel, who rarely let her face soften, cracked a smile one evening when Miriam scolded Jesse for chopping wood like a fool, taking the axe herself and showing him the clean strike of the blade. The laughter that followed was not loud, not careless, but it was real, and it lingered in the air longer than smoke. The cabin rose again, scarred but stronger. Every patch of clay, every nail hammered into new shingles, every stone laid on the hearth carried the mark of their hands. Jesse no longer saw himself as master or even protector. He was one piece among six, bound to them as they were to him. When the fire burned at night and their shadows swayed on the walls, he felt something he had never found on the long, empty trails he had wandered. He felt at home, not because the cabin stood, but because they stood in it together. The seasons shifted slow and steady, carrying with them the rhythm of survival that became almost like song. Winter bled into spring, the earth softening beneath their boots, green shoots pushing up where snow had once laid heavy. Summer followed with heat that baked the roof shingles and left their throats dry, but the creek ran clear, and the garden Miriam had planted grew tall with corn and beans. By autumn, the leaves fell bright and crisp, and the cabin stood not as ruin but as a place alive, marked by every hand that had worked upon it. Travelers sometimes passed along the ridge, hunters or traders, men who carried news from town, or whispers from farther trails. They spoke of the cabin now with a strange kind of awe, as though it were more than a shelter tucked into the hills. They said a drifter and 5 women lived there, that they had faced fire and raiders, that they had survived when others would have scattered. Some told the story with scorn, laughing at the notion of a man sharing his home with so many cast-offs. But others spoke of it with a respect that lingered, as though they saw in it something rare. The tale spread until even strangers who had never seen Jesse's face spoke of the cabin as if it were legend. Inside, life moved with quiet constancy. Ruth's sharp tongue softened into humor, her laughter surprising them all when it came, carrying warmth into evenings around the fire. Isabel's silence became a steady anchor, her hands skilled with rifle, needle, and tool, her presence as unshakable as the beams above them. Clara grew bold, her eyes no longer lowered, her voice stronger, quick with teasing words that often drew Juniper into laughter she had once hidden. Miriam's strength kept them steady, her shoulders bearing burdens with a calm that gave the others rest. Juniper herself, once silent as stone, began to hum as she worked, her voice soft but carrying, filling the cabin with a music no one had known they missed. Jesse changed too. Where once he had drifted with no root deeper than the dust beneath his boots, now he stood steady, not as the master of 5 women, but as one among them, the keeper of a family no one else had wanted. He no longer thought of the cabin as an inheritance, but as a promise, one he lived each day. His hands bore the scars of work. His shoulder still ached from the night of fire and blood, but his heart was steadier than it had ever been. By the hearth one night, Miriam spoke the words that lingered long after. She said they were no man's brides, no widows bound to sorrow, but family, forged from fire and survival. Jesse, listening, nodded, his voice low as he said the cabin would endure because they had chosen to stay. And as the wind whistled outside and the stars burned above the hills, the cabin stood, not just wood and stone, but a home carved out of shame and loss, turned into something stronger than either. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.